The sport of football dates back hundreds of years and has a reputation for bolstering some of the most supportive fans from any athletic commissions in the world. But on some occasions, the support gets out of hand, which often leads to disastrous and violent outcomes. However, this event may just take the cake, as I don't think many football matches have destroyed military aircrafts. The football war, despite its intriguing name, places much of its blame on political policies and land disputes more so than it does football. But the fact that a game of football can be considered a catalyst at all is rather intriguing. So here's what actually happened. The nations of El Salvador and Honduras had been in political dispute over land claims and illegal immigration since 1962, as despite being only 1/5 the size of Honduras, El Salvador had a population that was roughly 40% larger, meaning that many citizens were immigrating, both legally and illegally, to Honduras, until roughly 10% of their population was Salvadorian. Ultimately, this impacted the amount of land that was available to native Hondurans, and notably, corporations, which resulted in the passing of a land reform bill in 1967, removing any of the settled Salvadorians from their land, regardless of their immigration status. However, nothing acted as a greater catalyst to the already brewing tensions than the two nations' confrontation during the 1970s World Cup qualifiers, which saw peaceful matches turn to chaos, ultimately leaving one Honduran fan dead, and the formation of mass anti-Salvadorian riots, actions which only aided in the growing unrest between the two nations, and began blurring the lines between what was political and simply civil disputes. Moreover, by the final match of the 1970 qualifiers, the two nations would have dissolved their political ties entirely, recorded here by the CIA. And by the 14th of July, 1969, the tensions between the two nations would have reached their peak when the Salvadorian military used their P-51 Mustangs and civilian aircraft to bomb several areas in Honduras, marking the start of the conflict, recorded here again by the CIA. These actions were followed suit by ground assaults, securing El Salvador roughly 8 kilometers of land before being halted due to resistance. And only 2 days later, on the 16th of July, Honduras would have acted out their own campaign, bombing Salvadorian targets such as their airport and ports. Likewise, the government encouraged their civilians to arm themselves and defend the front lines, both of which recorded here once again by the CIA. One of the final battles of the war was conducted only 3 days after it began, when 6 military aircrafts engaged in a dogfight, which left one Salvadorian captain dead, and by the next morning, on July 18th, only 4 days after the war began, the two forces would enter resolutionary negotiations hosted by the OAS, which ultimately resulted in a ceasefire, although agreements to withdraw by El Salvador were ignored until the 2nd of August. Regardless, despite its short-lived nature, the damage from the conflict had already been done, which saw as many as 900 Salvadorians dead, plus 3 of their aircraft destroyed, alongside 2,100 Hondurans killed, many of which were civilians. Moreover, the conflict would have much larger consequences, leaving thousands of Hondurans homeless and hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians displaced. Likewise, this conflict acted as one of the root causes for the Salvadorian Civil War, which took place a decade after the conflict, and any trade that occurred between the two nations was stopped entirely, demonstrating just how significant this short-lived war really was. Oh, and on a side note, El Salvador lost all 3 matches in the 1970s World Cup. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for future content.